The Creative Writer's Way.
Writing is fundamental. It is our way. From stories come history. From history comes belonging. From belonging comes a sense of where we were, where we are, and where we are going. This is the foundation of civilization.
This is Dr. Skyler Madison. Find your story at skylermadison.com.
Hello and welcome to The Creative Writer's Way. This is Dr. Skyler Fontana, and this show is designed to provide you with insights and help on how to engage your creative side through writing and telling stories. Today I will be talking about how some famous writers have gotten the idea for their stories. But first, let me introduce myself. As with most children, stories were always an important part of my life. I loved to read and lose myself in the story and even act them out. That was behind my early dream to be an actress. Eventually, I came to realize I loved to act because I loved the stories. Throughout my life, it was the love of the stories that really was the red thread. And I'm happy to say I have now come back full circle to the work that I do right now, which is geared to helping people to find and develop their stories, to unlock their creative side. This is my calling. And so what, you may be wondering, is a calling? A calling is something that we're drawn to do, that expresses our true nature and allows us to contribute or do what we are most passionate about, using our natural gifts and abilities. We all long to pursue our callings. This is what I believe Joseph Campbell meant by his famous statement, "Follow your bliss." Campbell said, if you do follow your bliss, you put yourself on a kind of track that has been there all the while waiting for you. And the life you ought to be living is the one you are living. Each of us just may begin to identify this bliss that Campbell was referring to by telling our stories. And as he said, don't be afraid, the doors will open where you didn't know they were going to be. So we all have stories within us. If nothing else, I think embarking on a creative pursuit like this can make us feel more energized and excited than we have for a long time. As for me, it was a roundabout route that included a stint working on Wall Street and with the Mad Men on Madison Avenue that finally led to the career I launched in 2000, coaching people on how to work with the unconscious, to break unwanted habits, and create the life they wanted. That's what led to my decision to get my PhD and the dissertation that I did, which focused on using active imagination to unblock creativity, to do what I call dial up the muse, write from our personal psychology and learn how to partner with the unconscious. That's what I help people to do. All of this has helped me in my own writing and coaching people to express their unique side and find their creative side through expressive writing. So what we find is that writing our stories can even be somewhat therapeutic. That's why I created the workshops, The Creative Writer's Way, and this podcast that you're listening to now. So now I'd like to turn to one of my favorite subjects. How do writers get their ideas? Many writers say that the germ of a story idea is somewhat ephemeral, coming from something they heard, they remembered, or something that was written about that triggers something, perhaps an emotion or even a memory. Novelist Annie Oakley explains it this way. She said, the first insight, the germ, the prod of the feeler, is unconscious, even though it may stem from something as actual as a newspaper headline, or the sight of a child's sneaker beside a skid mark in the street. Something has stirred in the perceptual domain, an image flashing to mind that sets up intriguing questions. The conscious mind now ponders these, making lists, setting up a system of file cards to do research, formulating computer entries in the left brain with its linear analytic mode, saturating it with relevant information. And that was all, by the way, her quote. Saul Bellow called fiction the higher autobiography. And Stephen King said, every character you write is partly you. Well, okay, I'm not sure about that. And I would also say potentially someone you know. What we need is a place to start. These starting points often emerge from a combination of sparks. William Faulkner found his idea for the novel The Sound and the Fury in a combination of scenes from his own childhood and the characters he had just written about in a short story. All of that morphed into an image of a young girl. Imagine that, with muddy drawers, up in a tree, peering through a window at the wake of her grandmother. The images and the memories were intriguing enough. Image and memories go together, and emotions, to draw him into imagining and writing that novel. And what about Neil Gaiman, the author of The Ocean at the End of the Lane and other novels? He gave some interesting insights to this in a blog post, Where Do You Get Ideas? He recommended that the creative process would best begin with asking questions like, well, what else? What if? And if only. Also be an image or an idea, such as a woman sitting in a dark room filled with empty faces, or an idea like a boy who wants to know about magic. Plots just start to generate themselves when one begins to ask oneself questions, whatever the starting point is, and that's all Neil's advice. Mathew Weiner, creator of Mad Men, he recently shared his experience in breaking out of writer's block after finishing the final series of a TV show. He had decided to write a novel as a creative pivot, particularly for someone used to writing for TV. The idea of Heather in totality came to him while walking around the Upper East Side of New York. He saw an attractive teenage girl walking into an apartment building under construction and was struck by the look on the face of one of the construction workers. Later, he began to think about the idea for his novel, and that image floated back into his consciousness, becoming the germ for his psychological thriller about members of a wealthy New York family whose lives cross with a sociopathic construction worker. Beginning to get the message here? It's pretty cool stuff. So what we find is that the image, something observed or an idea, sparks an emotion within us, which can lead to combining that with something else. Orson Scott Card, who wrote science fiction and fantasy, said, "Good stories don't just come from trying to write a story the moment I first think of the idea. All but a handful of my stories have come from combining two completely unrelated ideas that have been following their own tracks through my imagination. From ideas that have ripened for many months, usually years, between the time I first thought of them and the time they were ready to be put into a story." Many people find also turning to mythical stories can inspire their imagination. From a Jungian point of view, these stories are what we call archetypal encounters that tell us how the collective psyche, the one that's common to all of us, undergoes development. Myths, fairy tales, and other stories that have come down through the centuries are generally not considered to be owned by any given person. Many of them are in what we call the public domain, which means that the original author's intellectual rights have expired. They're available to the public and are not subject to copyright protection. These stories can then be used to help us come up with our own storylines by altering the characters, the settings, by adding a motive for the conflict with the antagonist, altering the point of view from which the story is told. They can dynamically activate and trigger the discovery of new possibilities. This was the case with both Suzanne Collins and Gregory Maguire. Collins' best-selling Hunger Games was inspired by a mashup of the myth Theseus and the Minotaur and her own memories and, believe it or not, watching something on reality TV. In the myth, as punishment for challenging Crete, Athens was forced to send 7 boys and 7 girls to Crete every 9 years. The children were thrown into the labyrinth and eventually devoured by the Minotaur until Theseus volunteered to go and slay the Minotaur. Reality TV and her memories of her father's stories that she remembers him telling about Vietnam strengthen this mythic inspiration. And in an interview, Collins said, there's a quote, "I was channel surfing between reality TV programs and actual war coverage. And on one channel, there's a group of young people competing for I don't even know what. And then on the next, there's a group of young people fighting in an actual war. I was really tired, and the lines between these stories started to blur in an unsettling way. That's the moment when Katniss's story came to me. One was a reality show with young people competing, and the other actual footage about young people fighting the war in Iraq." Fascinating, right? It was a cultural myth of sorts that also inspired Gregory Maguire's groundbreaking novel Wicked, which of course was made into a Broadway musical based on a more contemporary mythic story told by L. Frank Baum, the Wizard of Oz. Rather than retelling Baum's tale, Maguire's story focused on the backstory that led up to Dorothy's arrival, centering on the misunderstood green-skinned girl who grows up to be the Wicked Witch of the West. There are many other inspiring examples, including C.S. Lewis's retelling of the story of Cupid and Psyche in the book that he wrote, Till We Have Faces, which some believe was his best book. You might be inspired by a fairy tale classic such as Jack and the Beanstalk. Your version might not look like anyone else's version, but it might be based on the same tale, and you could use a large or small part of the story to write it in your own vision. A writer can also reinterpret the story or do what's called a mashup, combining a pre-existing work from classic fiction with another genre such as horror. Jason Recolak, for example, had a cool mashup idea and gave it to Seth Grahame-Smith, who wrote Pride and Prejudice and Zombies. Mashups have also been a successful way to attract publishers and have the books be optioned for film and TV. At the end of the day, stories give us the ability to give voice to our powerful personal cultural issues in a way that affects and reaches people, and here's the key word, emotionally. So I ask you, well, what could be more fun? And what about you? Why not consider joining me and Joe Fontana, an LA-based producer, for a day in Malibu in a workshop designed to help you find your story idea and empower your writing? For more information on this, and perhaps to even get a ticket, you can go to www.skylermadison.com. That's SKYLER Madison.com. I hope you have enjoyed this as much as I have. Thank you.
The Creative Writer's Way.
To touch the reader inside is to tap into where we live. It is common to us all. It is unique to us all. Finding that path is the hero's journey. The journey begins with you.
This is Dr. Skyler Madison. Find your story at skylermadison.com.